I hope you have all had an amazing week. It has been powerful and inspiring. I have heard so many lessons from those of you in the room, but we are not done. We have one more amazing panel, one more conversation to connect, inspire, engage, that supports us to be able to resist, protect, and empower our networks, our communities, and ourselves. I'd like to begin with a thank you to the folks that allowed us to be here today. If you enjoyed the content, raise your hand. Woo! Thanks. Good job, guys. That content would not have been available had it not been from the over 110 folks who submitted session proposals, or from our amazing planning committee who went through those 110 proposals to narrow down to this amazing content today. We had folks that represented our local New Orleans and Louisiana community. We had representatives from all of our change partner organizations. We had representatives from other affinity-like partners and organizations that were here to do our work. So I want to thank them all for the support and for bringing us to this point in building the content and sharing this event with us. In addition, if you liked your content, please do keep your Wovia app up before you take it off your computers or off your phones, and rate the sessions that you were in. There's a rate button, and all the surveys are tied to each one of the sessions, each one of the experiences that we had. We really would like your feedback, and we'd appreciate you taking that time to do that. We also wouldn't be here today if it wasn't for our change partners. If I could have all the staff from all of the 10 change partners that are here with us today, please rise. It is the work of these organizations supporting the broader network of this community of philanthrofolk that allows us to continue this work together, allows us to begin to deepen and change the field. I also want to take a moment to thank the folks that made this experience together with us powerful and amazing. Because those of you who don't know, Change Philanthropy is this person physically right here, and that is it. And for this event, we had planned for 450 people. We were supposed to cut off at 600, and I couldn't say no to people, so we got to 700-ish. So thank you for being here. We couldn't have done it without our team special gathering. The ladies in the room, you've seen them all over the place. You've seen them running around. T, April, Grace, Danny. They have been behind the scenes running nonstop since we've been here on the ground. And Danny has been my partner in crime since we began this. She has been hustling with me, late night phone calls. I think I talked to her for the last 6 weeks, like 6 times a day. So thank you to the folks that help us create this space. In addition to that, I want to give a big shout out to the Marriott New Orleans hotel staff. They have supported every request we've thrown at them. They have supported us in this space. The food has been phenomenal. I have gotten a plate hidden in the back every time, and I might have gotten a bite off of each one of them. But this has been powerful and amazing. And they also explained this new ritual and celebration that I have on me, which I will tell you later about. But I really want to thank the folks here in this room, the staff in front of house, behind house, they really have been moving to make this work for us. The community organizations that we visited as part of the community learning tours, the preparation that they put into this and to us being here. Our folks on the ground, the Converge team, who really pulled us together in space while we're here on the ground and grounded us in this moment. In addition, we want to thank the folks that allowed us to be able to create this space, provided us the trust that we were going to put on a powerful event in space, and those are our sponsors. We want to thank the Ford Foundation, the William and Flora Hewlett Foundation, the Himes Foundation, Open Societies Foundation, the W.K. Kellogg Foundation, Anna E. Casey Foundation. Pause for another clap. Our ally sponsors, Annenberg Foundation, the Barr Foundation, Casey Family Programs, Marguerite Casey Foundation, the Robert R. McCormick Foundation, and the Kresge Foundation. Our advocate sponsors, the Executive Alliance for Boys and Men of Color, the Proteus Fund, the Advocacy Fund, Converge, and then our final set of sponsors, the Amy Mendel Katina Rodas Fund, the Greater New Orleans Funders Network, Emerging Practitioners in Philanthropy, Edward W. Hazen Foundation, and the Foundation for Louisiana. So we want to thank everyone that brought us here, that supported us being here, that supported scholarships for other folks to be here, for you for dedicating the time and energy out of your days to come and find family and community with us. And as I said, we have one last opportunity to really take what we have learned, the lessons we're here today, the stories we have learned, and move this into action. And for that purpose, we're calling up our change partners and a few of our closest friends to move us forward in this conversation. So if we could have our folks join us on the stage. You're going to hear from our change partners as they give us a call for action and inspiration to move the work forward, to take what you've heard, what you felt, what you've been stewing about, and take it to the next level. We're honored to have three close partners and allies in this work join us as moderators. So we'll begin with James Head, the East Bay Community Foundation President.
Well, I guess I could stay there, huh?
You can sit there.
Okay. So good afternoon, everybody. It's been a great time together. So we are going to start off with a question. I'm going to moderate, and we have 4 panelists who will respond to the question. And since this is about what we do when we go back, I do have one suggestion that I thought about as I went around talking to people who were from the Bay Area. And that is, those of us who were here together should make sure that we reconvene when we get back and really talk about what happened here and how we ought to energize what we have at home. So you have this WOVA app that I think Carly mentioned. And you should make sure that you find somebody in your office who can help you identify who from the Bay Area, for example, was here. I'll need that help. And then I'll have that person help me delete these 350 messages that I have on my phone. But that's another story. But I think part of it is to really share what we've heard here with others. And so I want to introduce the panel. I'll just give names and titles, and then we'll ask the question. They'll have about 3 minutes each to respond. I will keep time, although we also have a timekeeper who will help. So on my panel cluster, To my left, actually, is Deborah Holmes, and Deborah is the Chief Communications and Engagement Officer for the Women's Funding Network. Next to Deborah is Amelia Greensburg Delgado, who's the Director of U.S. Programs and Operations for Hispanics in Philanthropy. And then we have our beloved Sarah Eaglehart, who is the CEO of Native Americans in Philanthropy. And last and not least is Cora Merikatani, who is the President and CEO of Asian Americans and Pacific Islands in Philanthropy. So the question is, throughout the summit, we've heard stories of funders working both to respond to and support movement-building strategies from grantee partners, but also trying to play a role in shaping systems change for equity in their capacity. So how can funders advance both of these responsive and proactive goals? Cora, I'll go back to the front and start with you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, everyone. I always feel in good hands and lucky when I'm with James Head. So I hope that applies to you today. I guess my response to that question on the responsive end, we've heard so many incredibly good insights and good suggestions about how funders can be more responsive, be quicker in this moment of community, I guess, pressure and crisis. The three things that I think stuck out for me that I would advocate that funders pay attention to are, number one, really committing to multi-year, unrestricted general operating support for trusted partners. And by that, I don't mean project support in disguise of general operating support. I really do mean, lessening the strings to allow your trusted partners to do their work. The second thing I think that could be important is really thinking about capacity building. And I know in philanthropy, capacity building comes and it goes, and then it comes and it goes. I think we're in the it goes period now. But I do think it's important that organizations that are doing frontline work, they're fragile, they're running on fumes, they need help. And it's not to say they're weak or they are less than powerful, but this is the time to think about that. And the third thing in terms of the responsive mode for funders, I think really considering a commitment to what the care and feeding of leadership looks like, what that means, and whether or not you want to call that fellowships or sabbaticals or other kinds of nurturing that allows those incredibly necessary visionaries to have a place to hang on is really important right now. So that's on the responsive end. And on the proactive end, I do have a little bit of bias here because I think, I've worked in institutional philanthropy for a number of years myself, so I really understand that it's hard sometimes to embrace what I call the sliver. So embrace the sliver. And what do I mean by that? I mean, when I think of the sliver, as identity-based communities of color, who might represent in gross numbers, sort of small groups. And so you know that you've either given or heard the response, well, we really understand your problem and issues, we support you, but your numbers are too small really to be important enough for us as a foundation to get a bang for our buck. And therefore, by continuing to embrace that notion, there are really important communities who are invisible and in need. And I can certainly speak for Asian Americans, Pacific Islander communities, that they do suffer, I think, that analysis and that fate way too often. So I encourage funders to take a second look at that. By sliver, I also mean community-based organizations. And you know them well. They kind of barely meet foundation eligibility requirements. They may have handed in a few late reports, but they're really the ones doing the absolute necessary work now. And so I think it's not to forgive or to set a lower bar, but it's to say, we understand and we embrace you as the leading tip of the arrow, that sliver, to make the work happen. And my final thought about the sliver analogy is that funders really need to make a commitment to leadership. And leadership in this space, that sliver, is sometimes a little bit outspoken. They're a little bit young, or maybe they're a little bit not so young. They speak the truth to power. And I think it's really important to say, you know, now if there is a time, is the time to support leadership. Because without that, we have no chance to have success in resistance. So I'd say, you know, my feeling is those three things in terms of productivity are really important to make this all work right now.
Thank you. Go ahead. Sarah?
Well, obviously ditto to everything that Cora says, because I think we all believe in that. And I would say as one of my perspectives coming in, you know, many of our organizations are 25 to 30 years old. And so for me, really looking at this moment, I feel like people have been saying like, oh my gosh, this is a brand new moment. But it's not, because we've all been created for this exact moment. That's why we're here. We're in the depth of all of it. And so for me, what it really meant is looking at the intersections of the work and focusing on those intersections for impact has been one of the things that I think is a very proactive thing to do and something that I do in my work. And so for me, that means that the work looks a little bit differently. It doesn't look like grandma's philanthropy organization anymore. And I think that's a good thing, but that's also it's a holistic worldview. It's an indigenous worldview to look at how those issues intersect and how we can respond to them. So that means reaching out to unlikely allies, making sure that if there's a voice missing at the table, that you're calling it out. If you have an initiative, that there's some proactiveness on your end to make sure and include. And then finally, I guess I would say for us, there's a huge need for decolonization. You know, I get the response all the time. You know, when Cora said here, you know, that funders say that there's not enough of you and your statistics are so low, and I hear that all the time. And my immediate thought is, do you know why? I mean, really, like why? Do you know why that is? And so for Native Americans, this response, you know, and rebuilding of our communities has everything to do with this history. So, and I had a funder one time who I was visiting with them on the phone, and they were sort of giving me the bad news of like saying, oh, I'm sorry, I just don't think our funding is going in a different way. And I said, okay, you know, I completely understand that. And I said, well, you know, it'd be really great if you could spend some time, invest your time in learning about our community. And he was really interesting because, you know, I said, I know that many funders just don't have that education and haven't spent that time to learn and sit in our worldview. And his response was like, oh, you're speaking truth to power. And he's like, oh, good job, you're speaking truth to power. And I thought to myself, I said to him, I was like, actually, I'm not. This is just a fact. And yeah, and that's how I feel. So I'll just stop there.
Right. Thank you, Sarah. Amelia, but Sarah, I thought your response was likely to be, no, I'm speaking directly to you. Amelia?
Well, for me, the question with us is, what are funders' role in movement building? And essential to any movement building is the deep relationships that funders can create with communities. However, in the creation of those relationships, similar to I think what my colleagues here have been talking about, are the power dynamics that are at play. So when we're coming into a space where we are trying to be collaborative, trying to build together a strategy, what results from that without, despite good intentions and good faith in the efforts, looking at the power dynamics at play. And so one strategy that we propose is stop and listen. Stop and listen and make sure that you're not the person up there creating the strategy, but rather you're stepping back and making sure that the people in the room are from the community, are people of color, are intersectional in terms of looking at who is isolated, who has been in hiding, whose voice is not at the table, and stopping to listen to them in terms of the strategies and the voices that are brought up in order to see how the movement is going to be going forward. And in part of that, and part of the conversations I've been having over the last few days is understanding that the strategy and the points at the table will be multifaceted, that we will see a panoply of ideas and strategies that all move together to the same end and are all necessary in order to get us to the same end, particularly in times of injustice where the powers at play are tremendous and incredibly well funded. So some ideas in terms of how do we break some of the power imbalances that exist within our own foundations and organizations. One is looking internally at operations, understanding what our hiring practice, recruitment, retention policies are doing in terms of that strategy building and that decision making. Who are the people at the table from those funder organizations, and are they people of color who are experienced from the community, who have the relationships and the ability to build those relationships? There's other methodologies that we've talked about over the last few days, talking about creating community-driven grant-making boards and advisory boards where the funder is building a strategic plan, is coming together to review requests for proposals, and is allowing for decision making to be, again, multifaceted and multi-pronged. And so another point that I want to make is that we talked about in the gender panel that we talked about is internal audits. So besides the hiring practices, what else are we doing in order to be meaningful in terms of collaborating and partnering with other organizations, with community-based groups in order to move this our strategies forward together? So I'll close with it. In this political climate, with injustices that we're seeing, it is our call to action to step forward as true partners with communities, allowing for those voices to rise up and to take part and make those decisions in how the strategy is going to be set. And so I look forward to working with many, many, many of you, and I'm excited for what is to come.
Great. And so, thank you. So, Deborah, I know we just have a few minutes left, and I know you have a plane to catch, so I'm sure you'll bring it home for us in terms of your thoughts.
Yes, I will bring it home, because I will tell the truth. So I think there's an internal and an external. Internally, we need to get our own house in order. That means it's not just the hiring practices, it's who's on your finance committee. What firms are you using to manage your investments and so forth? Are there people of color? Are there firms of color on there? If our own houses are not in order, folk will call us out, and they will do so justifiably. Externally, we need to get over our fear of black and brown people, and get over our fear of this thing about sharing power. I mean, because black and brown folks have been organizing forever. It's our life. If you'd have listened to us in the first place, we might not be in this situation. But seriously, there is concern. I don't know those people, or they don't know what they're doing. They actually do know what they're doing. And to Amalia's point, to visit, and Sarah's point, visit those communities, be where they are. But the most important thing, James, is actually something you said a couple of months ago that sticks in my head. It's like, we need to find the groups, give them the money, and then step out the way. I mean, they know what they're doing. Trust me. 30 years of women's foundations have proven that women-led organizations know what the heck they're doing, locally and globally. You have to trust that they know what they're doing, and based on the workshop I was in right beforehand, understand that mistakes will be made. Failures do happen, and that's okay, because you pick yourself up and you do the next thing. So we need to be the kind of change we want to be, the change we seek. We need to act like it, and we need to live it every day, and we can do that by taking these small steps. And then the third thing I would say is, as funders, perhaps we could collaborate so that small groups don't have to reapply for funding every year and fill out grant applications. Maybe if several of our organizations combined resources and gave somebody a $100,000 grant, that would last them for 3 years. And guess what? They could be doing the work instead of doing paperwork.
Thank you, Deborah. So I'll turn it back over to Carly, but please join me in thanking my panel for their time.
Thank you. And now we'll move to our next cluster for conversation with Takima Robinson, the founder and principal at Converge.
Good afternoon, friends. So just really quickly, Converge, our mission is to accelerate the creation of a radically just new world where communities of color thrive. One of the ways that we get to do that is through our work organizing the Greater New Orleans Funders Network. And so I just want to recognize the 40 local and national foundations who are funding in this region around equity and justice. Folks who have put their money on the table and who have also put their voices out there. So I also want to ask you, have you guys eaten well? Were you well taken care of? We are so happy that you were here in our city with us, our beautifully complicated city, and we hope that you've been well taken care of. So now I get a chance to talk to my posse, my tribe. So Susan Batten, CEO of AppFi. Janae Eisler, VP and Chief Engagement Officer of NCRP. And Tamir Novotny, the Executive Director of EPIP. So here we are, we spent these last 3 days together, and the question here is really around this issue, this trending theme around equity. So equity is trending, cities are talking about equity, the nonprofits we are supporting are talking about equity, and our field is talking about it. And so people are leaning into the conversation. But the question is, how do we make sure that the equity work we have talked about over the past 4 days really gets embedded into philanthropy, and it is not just a trend that washes over the field, only leaving us with the status quo. So I'm going to start with Susan, and we'll work our way down.
Great. Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon. I was listening to make sure I was answering the right question, because there were a number of questions. So, this has been such a learning experience for me personally. I just want to thank all of you for being here and for the work that you do. And, in response to the question, while it sounds simple, the issue of leadership is just central for me, and more central as I walk away from these strategy sessions in New Orleans. And when I think about leadership, I'm thinking about it in a couple of ways. One is how we get more intentional about who we recruit into the field, right? When I think about listening to many of your stories and who's doing great work out there, when I think about the leaders that AbbVie acknowledged last night, Tynesha McCarris and Nat Williams, many of these folks are coming in with community organizing backgrounds, right? And I think we actually need to get a little more explicit about bringing folks in from that base that have done community organizing. I said, Deborah, you said we've been doing it for years, but they're bringing, it's really interesting to watch. They're bringing a skill set that we need to embed equity in institutions and to make it stick. They're bringing skill sets like power mapping and power analysis, facilitating agreement across diverse groups, different perspectives, and like communicating well, being able to frame, and most importantly, values and principles and ethics about being connected constituency and community, right? Because what I kept hearing in some of the deep conversations over the last couple of days was, make sure you're connected to the folks on the ground, make sure you're connected to the folks on the ground. Well, we need to bring more ground folks inside. And I would ask you to be more intentional about how we lift up those skills and make them as necessary as some of the other skills that typically funders are looking for when we're looking for talent in the field. So that's one in terms of who we bring in. The second is who governs. Who governs? I just, when we think about the power in philanthropy, the power sits at the top. And this is not to slight CEOs or staff. Often we say power comes from the middle, but we, again, cannot overlook the importance of trustees. And I just implore you to get your trustees connected to a posse. Get them connected to a tribe. Because when you think about it, they're making the most important decisions around policy, sometimes grant making, and they're not from the field, right? They're coming from different sectors around the country. So getting your trustees into conversations and peer groups that are equity-based, and I know we are doing trustee organizing, HIP has been doing trustee organizing. Ben, you said funders may want to get more into that. I just ask you to really intentionally think about a trustee strategy. We've got to stack these boards. We've got to get more folks on the boards because, and most importantly, they pick the CEOs, right? So just who governs vis-a-vis leadership is critically important. And then the third is really, again, about organizing leadership. And this is really important. I have such respect for all colleagues here, and our organizations are critically important. And I'm actually asking, this is a real ask of you all, to keep the Partners of Change philanthropy whole. We are at a time where we're seeing, I believe, downturns and investments in infrastructure groups like ours, right? And we really need you all to keep us whole, and also understanding that your staff really, really need us. I mean, we did a report called The Exit Interview back in 2014, looking at why Black program officers were leaving the field. And it's a good read, and sort of issues that many of you are familiar with. But the other thing I kept hearing over and over again over the last couple of days is find your tribe. If you're going to stay in this work, find your tribe. So it's just an ask that you help keep the change partner organizations individually whole and collectively together. 3 points. Yeah.
For me, I wanted to answer this question in thinking about NCRP's journey as well, because equity to me is not just about what one organization does or what one person does, but it has to be a community effort. So, NCRP for decades has been advocating that the sector adopt practices that lead to equity. And we've been really wrestling with ourselves over those decades as well to make sure that we're in integrity. So right now we are figuring out how to implement a new strategic framework. And it's hard. It's hard, y'all. It's real hard. Change is hard, transformation is hard, and primarily holding ourselves accountable to our own value systems and our own integrity is really, really difficult. So my 2 points more or less focus on what it means to be in this for the long game. So first, I think we have to do the inside work. We have to do the internal work. And that means that within institutions who say they are about advancing equity, each individual really has to ask themselves, why am I doing this? Why is my organization doing this? Why am I doing this? And be really, really honest. Because if we're doing this because a big funder is going to give a lot of money to groups that are advancing equity, just be real about that, because that is a starting place. And there are lots of organizations like NCRP and ABFE and PRE and all the folks on this stage and a lot of folks in this room who have resources to take you from whatever starting place you are at to where you need to be. But you can't do that if you're not honest about why we're initiating this work in the first place. And there's really no wrong answer, because at the end of the day, we need equity. So whatever your motivation, we're going to work with you to move you from wherever you are to wherever it is we need to be successful. The other point is, again, what I said earlier, that equity is achieved in community. So this can't be done alone. And for me, community is actually about accountability. That requires a level of transparency and honesty and invitation to other people to hold us accountable. So tell someone your intentions and your plans for equity. So that's both intentions and plans for equity. That looks like, if you're a funder, telling peer funders, maybe talking to funders who have made strides in advancing equity, asking for their advice. But primarily it means talking to community, talking to organizers and advocates who have the most to lose and who are risking the most on a day-to-day basis, and inviting those people into an accountability relationship with us. That means that I go to community and I say, this is what we're thinking about to advance equity, and constantly asking, often and early, are we doing it right? What are we doing it wrong? Please hold us accountable. So that part is not easy either, because people aren't going to trust us. People don't trust us. People don't trust funders. People don't trust large institutions, because large institutions have failed over and over again to be an honest, accountable relationship. So the onus is on us to genuinely seek that feedback and accountability and deeply engage and be vulnerable and transparent in what we do. So what I'm going to leave you with, again, is that advancing equity is hard. And it's long, it's sustained work. For NCRP, we are constantly on a journey. We don't have it 100% right. We are constantly course correcting. But the bottom line is that equity is about transforming how we do what we do. And it's not about a temporary or a finite initiative. So if we really want to make sure that the popularity right now about equity and philanthropy stays course, then we need to hold one another accountable and say, is your foundation, is your institution about transforming how you do the work, or is your institution about advancing an idea? Advancing an idea is not going to lead to equity. We have to make sure that we are transforming ourselves and helping one another transform how we do what we do.
So I want to get tactical. It's really easy to come away from these things really inspired and like, okay, so what do I do when I get home? And I want to do this, I want to try to do this in sort of two chunks. So first I want to talk to the executives in the room. And one of the ways that this work really washes over leaving the status quo in its wake is if we don't make the structural change, and if we don't make the cultural change that makes it stick. You can make a policy and it can sit on a shelf. You can make a policy and it can be too weak. And so that requires careful attention. It requires support from experts like the ones sitting on the stage with me right now in order to make sure you do it right and you learn from the mistakes that other people have made. It's worth the investment. While you do the structural pieces, you also have to look at the cultural pieces. As an executive, you can make a commitment, but your staff are the ones who know how it's actually going. And too often, and I can tell you because I hear these stories all the time, your staff know when the things that are actually happening in your organization and how they're working with communities are not landing the way you want them to, when they're getting lost even before they leave the organization. And often either they're afraid to tell you because it requires them to incur significant personal risk, or they've already told you and nobody's heard them and their concerns have been dismissed. And I just want to really acknowledge that that is racialized and it is gendered. And so we have to really think about what we are hearing when our people are talking to us. One thing that we can offer as part of what we're starting to do is we have a lot of insight into the way that our members are thinking and feeling. And I want to remind folks, our members are the diversity we want to see leading this field. 45% of our members identify as people of color, 2/3 is women, and 10% is LGBTQ. And if we want the numbers at the top to look like the numbers in our membership, we got some work to do. Now I want to talk a little bit about how we actually do the self-reflection involved in bringing about that culture change. And something that we wrestle with even internally as EPIP, as an organization of 3 soon-to-be 4 people, is what in our organizations is about effectiveness, and what in our organizations is actually just precedent that we've gotten from a corporate culture that is mired in white supremacy and in patriarchy, right? What constitutes evidence? What is admissible? How are we supposed to talk? How are we supposed to write? How important is that TPS report? You know? And where do we need to be more relational? Where can we learn from Indigenous ways of thinking? Where can we learn from African ways of thinking? Where can we just challenge ourselves to think about what constitutes effectiveness in a world where what we really want is basic human dignity and love between people? That's really hard stuff, but you have to have the ability to speak openly and honestly about that internally. Now I want to talk to the associates and the program officers in the room. I just want folks, raise your hand if you're a program associate or a program assistant or coordinator. Raise your hand. All right, now keep them up. Raise your hand if you are a program officer or an associate program officer or a manager. That's more than half the room. This is a powerful group. And the thing that happens is that one person goes to their boss and they say, I'm concerned about this, and I see how this is landing and it's not working. And their boss says, just do it, because you're here to perform a function. You won't say that, but that is the message. And so we actually have to take the conversations, the stories that we hear in the hallway and at the bar, they need to be on the conference room table, not in the hallway. But we cannot do that by encouraging one person to put themselves at more personal risk. So we're committing to putting some of that, out there in a way that protects our members, but gets the truth out there, and then we have to reckon with it together. And in order to do that, we have to organize.
So I just want to say thank you to my panel, and thank you all for your leadership, your authenticity, and integrity in your responses to the question.
And for our final insight and inspiration, we will have Marco Quiroga, the dynamic leader of Contigo Fund, as our moderator.
Good afternoon, everyone. Name is Marco Antonio Quiroga, and I'm the director for the Contigo Fund. And really quickly, it's the fund that emerged following the massacre in Orlando of June of last year to support the recovery efforts, the healing of the community members who are directly impacted because of the Pulse tragedy, particularly LGBTQ people of color who are distinctly impacted, and the future empowerment of those people to be self-determinant around what this tragedy means for them. And so we are, Contigo means with you in Spanish, and in all ways we are community-driven, which is something that is reflective of a lot of the things that we talked about, why it's so important to be led by communities, because it's honestly the best strategy that are most impacted by the troubles and issues that we are trying to discuss here. The question that I'm going to be asking the thought leaders and movement leaders next to me here is revolved around calls to action. And I wanted to take this opportunity because I felt remiss if I didn't ask this question about calls to action and didn't actually talk about a little bit about what motivates me. I am undocumented and unafraid. I'm queer and unashamed, and I'm here to stay. And I am committed to fighting for your liberation, because your liberation is my liberation. And I ask and I believe that you will stand up and be there for myself and the 800,000 other documented youth across this nation, but also the 11 million other undocumented individuals across this nation that also need to realize their liberation. Individuals like my mother. Individuals like my mother, who has taught me to be the activist I am today, and truly together I believe that we can win. So with that, I just want to turn it over and ask the question. Next to me I have Ben Francisco Malbec, President for Funders for LGBTQ Issues. We have Lori Villarosa, Executive Director of PRE. And we have Dennis Quirin, President of Neighborhood Funders Group. And the question I want to start off with, Ben, is where have you seen people get stuck in implementing the calls to action we've heard here, and what can they do to keep making progress?
Thanks, Marco. So for start, just in case any of you are afraid, I want to clarify, you know we each only get to talk once, right? Okay, so I want to build on what Marco just said and some things Susan was saying about, so one of the places things get stuck in terms of advancing equity work is there are not enough of us. Mm-hmm. There are still not enough queer people, people of color in this field, and there aren't enough of us who are willing to do this advocacy work that it takes to move the work forward. And then specifically, there are certain sets of lived experience that are woefully underrepresented. And one of them is, for example, Marco is the only out, undocumented person I know in a position of programmatic power in philanthropy. That's a travesty. We're here talking about how to advance immigrant rights, and we don't have people with that lived experience in the room when we're making these decisions. We know of we've done sort of an audit of transgender people in philanthropy, and we know of 18 paid professional transgender people in philanthropy, several of whom are not in programmatic positions or positions where they have authority over dollars. And most of whom, if they do have that authority over dollars, they're at public foundations where they're raising their own, they're raising their grant dollars, right? Which adds a whole other burden of work. People who have the experience of incarceration or direct experience with our justice system. We've spent the past few days talking about how to address criminalization. We don't have that expertise of lived experience almost ever at the table. So those are things that we need to correct. And one of the ways to do it is to create pipelines. So what Contigo has done with having a grants committee that drives the work that's completely made up of queer folks, of Latino folks, of folks affected by the tragedy. Trans Justice Funding Project is another entity that has a model like that, where it's completely driven by trans leaders who know trans movements. Those models are great because not only are they driven by the wisdom of people who know, because it's their lives, they also help give people experience with philanthropy. And then the last thing I want to allude to, I really appreciated Tamir talking to the executives, because one of the ways things get stuck is bad bosses, to just be really totally honest. And for that reason, that creates so much isolation. When people, we're all about to go home to places that are not as supportive as this environment has been, perhaps. So I really encourage you to find allies, to find a buddy. And actually, I would like for you, after this session is over, as we're mingling, find a buddy, say to someone maybe who you've heard and like connected with a bit, say, Ben said I should find a buddy. And so I thought maybe it could be you. And someone who you can just check in with and have, whether it's at your institution or somewhere else, that is just so important, just to prevent us from being isolated and to take care of ourselves and each other.
Thank you. And I want to thank all the partners on the stage with me. It's been a real honor working with you guys and putting together this conference and all the other work that we do and that we do with all of you all. I have the honor of being second to last. All the good stuff has been said. So I'm going to try to highlight a few things that I really want to make sure you guys think about. So when I think about getting unstuck and all the ways that you can get stuck as a grant maker, a couple of things definitely surface to the top for me. One is the reality of feeling overwhelmed and underinformed. It can feel like the problems in the world are enormous and your grant dollars are tiny. And it can also feel like you need to solve all the problems with your grant dollars. And the reality is you cannot. And there is something really powerful in recognizing what your realistic limits are right now, and not letting that hold you back. So I think every journey starts with a step. Part of how you have to get there is with other people. So collaboration, that's how you learn. That's how you share strategies. That's how you can think about the inside game and the outside game at the same time. Some folks have relationships that are going to be on one end of the spectrum, but aligned on the same goals from yours. Find those people. They may not feel like your allies. They may not feel like they speak the exact same language as you do. But unless we're working together in a more coordinated, collaborative way, we're never going to get there. There are hundreds of activists who have control over resources in this room. It may be that we don't have enough, but we have a lot. And we get in our own way by not finding each other, by not being real about what we know and what we don't know, and by not opening our books. There's a lot of conversations that happen in philanthropy. A lot. I'll talk about that in a second. But how many of those really advance your work in a deep collaborative way? And how many of those are you really being honest about what you don't know? And naming it is the first step in figuring out how to find the solutions. So I think honesty and transparency with yourself and with your colleagues is critically important. So the last thing I'll mention is we're all too busy. Everybody that I know is running around and hustling and spinning their wheels, and there's this frenetic, unproductive energy that kind of lives in philanthropy, and it's elsewhere, but I really see it a lot in philanthropy, where we are, I see more people that live in the Bay Area where I live on the road somewhere else than I see them in the Bay Area. And part of that is about collaboration, and a part of that is about not being able to prioritize and make choices. I think that if we could be clear about the most important work and focus more of our time on that, I think we could all be a lot more successful. So I think there's a lot of these personal practices that are a culture of the work that we're in, and it just takes being honest with ourselves and taking a step forward.
Good afternoon. I actually chose to be last, and what was interesting is it's such a great opportunity to be part of this panel and the Change team, because the reason I chose to be last was because I knew everybody would say the points that I wrote if I prepared beforehand. And so I thought, on one hand, I feel like, well, I've been preparing for 25 years of this work to see what's next. One of the things that, ditto to everything that folks have said, and it's really important to recognize that in that a lot of the lessons that you need have already been learned. And so there are resources and there are folks who have done this that you can go to. But one of the things that we find is what gets stuck, where foundations and individuals within foundations get stuck, is when they have no shared definition of what they are even talking about when they say what we are doing to get to equity. So there's really, are you talking about equity or are you talking about justice? And I think that we need to really name, we do want to talk about equity, but a lot of us want to talk about justice. And what that means is that we've got to talk about how to actually build power as well as how to address equity. So just making sure you have those spaces and that you do that. I would say the other thing that happens is some of the confusion about where to enter and where to lead. And we've talked about within your institution where to lead. What I get a lot of times are people who are trying to move foundations and move philanthropy and haven't really found out about what does the field think you are missing. And so they'll come to me and they'll want to know what they should do next. And I'll ask, have you scanned the community about what they think you're not doing? And they should be your first entry point. So really making sure you have those processes in place to do that. And then lastly, riffing off of what Dennis was saying, we find there's the mix of both lack of humility and lack of boldness. And even among the change agents, PRE does Racial Justice Funders Labs, which are invitation only to those foundations who are further along and who have the leaders who are really doing more work in this area. And we find even when we put it to them, the first half of our lab will be focusing on how far can we go? If you really thought about what is needed right now, what do you really believe the change needs to be, it constantly suffers from the shrinkage of what is viable, what is realistic, what is doable in their particular moment. And we don't think expansively enough about how far we need to go to match the needs in the field.
Thank you so much for your perspective.
I'll be alone again. Anyone who takes offense at a day in your celebration, you all know in my mind that there ought to be a time